Hello, and here and now is the first and only recorded interview with Christine Jorgensen. Miss Jorgensen, or may I call you Christine?
Please do, Mr. Russell.
Are you a woman?
That's a very good question. We seem to assume that every person is either a man or a woman. But we don't take into account this true scientific value that each person is actually both, in varying degrees. Now, this sounds a little evasive, and I don't mean it to be, when in all actuality my only answer to that is that I am more of a woman than I am a man.
I am losing my mind. I swear to God, if I hear or read the word exploration from Voice Guide one more time, I'm genuinely going to lose it. Just tell me exactly what to do without the forced quirkiness of play around with your voice and have fun. I am watching or reading your tutorial to fix a problem, not to have fun. Nobody goes to chemo nor watches the How to Fix Your Pipes video for fun or for exploration. For the love of all things holy, can somebody just provide a no BS, straight up, here's what you do guide? I thought I finally found it, only to smash into a wall again. This is not a video about how to change your voice. Honestly, there are just so many resources already online about that sort of stuff, and if you really want to know, I will link to some in the description that were helpful for me, as long as you keep in mind that what was helpful for me is just related to my experience, my expression, etc. However, this is not about voice training. This is the type of video I wish I had 2 years ago. Because when I started my transition, I had a lot of resources on how to change your voice and which types of techniques you could use. However, I couldn't really find that much about what it felt like to go through the experience. Truthfully, it's a very abstract thing to pick apart your voice in the most intimate way and find one that eventually feels more like you than you could ever imagine. And when I see posts like this, I honestly empathize, because a lot of the guides out there focus on vague sentiments like find what works for you and explore and express yourself. And truthfully, I don't think there's anything really wrong with that. I mean, you really can't live your life for anyone else, and that includes the way you speak. However, it can be difficult to know what to look out for if you don't know where to begin. And when I started my transition, it wasn't because I knew exactly who I was, but instead I knew who I wasn't. Everything with gender I had tried up until that point didn't work, and I realized I would regret it if I didn't allow myself to be a woman, the one possibility I was seemingly avoiding. But voice training, just like many parts of transition, became this weirdly abstract process of trying to express my authentic self before I even knew what that was. So this is not a guide for how to change your voice, and also I'm not going to address vocal feminization surgery just because it wasn't relevant to my transition. But this video is about what it was like to lose my voice, only to find a new one later. But before we can begin, we have to look at how society hears trans voices. Up until relatively recently, most trans representation in media focused not on what being trans was actually like, but instead what society feared or ridiculed. And voices played a role in that.
My first episode of Dirty Sexy Money, I had a big gathering with all my friends. I was so excited I was going to be on ABC. And I come on, everybody's like, yay! And then my first line,
I missed you.
They lowered it 2 octaves.
Regardless of how they sound, trans voices are often contextualized within harmful stereotypes.
Really?
Yeah, it was really silly.
Well, look, silly Billy, go on and do it, will you?
The moon belongs to everyone. The best things in life are free.
Do you believe this hair comb costs $10? $10.
A 25-year-old man who becomes a 25-year-old woman is not a woman at all, because a woman first has to be a little girl. Candy was never a girl. Candy was a fantasy she created herself.
Transphobia often assumes that someone's voice is a biological marker, something that will always be indicative of some truth that they can't change. And even outside of transness, voices are often characterized that way. Voice types are mainly a way to categorize technique and range, but you wouldn't necessarily know that based on how a lot of people talk about them. Instead, you are soprano or bass or whatever, but the human voice can change, and though there might be influences on why we speak the way we do and what is intuitive, those things aren't as set in stone as they might seem. When I started transitioning, I knew of the before and after of trans women with voices I admired, but I didn't understand what that process felt like for others. And when I tried to look into that, I realized just how quickly it could get pretty toxic. And my voice quickly became an obsession, more so than any other part of my transition. And honestly, my feelings about it are still pretty complicated. But 2 years later, I think about it much differently than I once did. The human voice is powerful and can do much more than you might think. But why is it so hard to talk about trans voices? And what do they even sound like? Here's my take. The moon belongs to everyone. The best things in life are free. The stars belong to everyone. They gleam right there for you and for me. The flowers in spring, the robins that sing, the sunbeams that shine, they're yours, they're mine. And love can come to everyone. The best things in life are free.
Voice is all about understanding what to listen for and what to take action towards.
Is vocal coaching worth it?
The one trick to voice feminization that will get you exactly where you need to get.
What is it about trans people that makes you so angry?
You portray an illusion you believe. If you believe it, the people will believe it. She's an example, I am, you are, we all are, of something that we all feel innate.
We already have this knowing of self, and a lot of people have not yet been able to do that.
This is my 2 months on T.
Hey guys, it's Jamie, and I am 6.5 years on T.
And love can come to everyone. The best things in life are free.
So this is what I sounded like pre-transition, and I'm sure some of y'all already know that just because I was a YouTuber before all of this. But I think when making a video about how my voice has developed, I think it's important to just show where it began. So let's talk about gay bears. Bears are usually gay men who are hairy. They can also be large, muscular, have dad bods, but in general, the common thread tying the bear community together is just an appreciation of masculinity. The identity in its modern sense comes from the mid-1980s in San Francisco, and many consider it to have been set in stone with the publication of Bear magazine in 1987, though gay men had been referred to as bears before. I think nowadays, with more mainstream acceptance of gay men, it's difficult to understand the political and cultural significance of bears in the 1980s US. But back then, there was even more discrimination against gay men for being effeminate, and focusing on masculinity was certainly not a new thing in gay culture, but specifically carving out an identity that was associated with the image of the all-American man had a purpose. Especially during the height of the AIDS epidemic, embracing masculinity was also a way to combat stereotypes of gay men that portrayed them almost exclusively as emaciated, dying patients. Like many parts of queer culture, the bear community is multifaceted and contains a variety of interpretations of what it means to be a bear and what their relationship to other parts of queer experience is, and that can get pretty complicated. But for many people, it's an outlet for a type of hypermasculinity that they can't really express elsewhere. And when I was a teenager, finding out about the term gay bear was the moment my sexuality really started making sense. And basically, as soon as I could grow facial hair, I did, modeling myself after the men I was attracted to, including how I spoke. And when I started writing songs, I looked to masculine gay men whose voices I admired as a way of trying to find my own. I'm a huge fan of the Magnetic Fields, and 69 Love Songs is one of my favorite albums. And at the height of my obsession with that album, I basically put on my best Stephen Merritt drag while singing.
I guess I could take a sleeping pill and sleep at will and not have to go through what I go through.
I could listen to my therapist, pretend you don't exist, not have to dream of what I dream of.
It took a choir teacher pointing out later on that I had more personality in a baritone range as opposed to a bass one for me to start using other parts of my voice.
I still can't see our relation to the ship we threw off course, and that's why, of course, I can't tell why I feel weak in the knees. Is my heart feeling love or is it feeling heart disease?
And that's where I basically stayed until I started transitioning. But while I was singing a lot and starting to develop my own style, in terms of speaking, I stayed in the bear drag, the type of resting masculine voice that I picked up from others, because, to be honest, I didn't even really think about it. And even though I started identifying as non-binary in an attempt to reconcile my underlying discomfort with gender, I was still struggling a lot with being a few layers deep in a type of masculinity I learned from others.
But that had to do with, like, I just spent a lot of my youth as a gay man, I guess. But that was just a few years ago that I realized that a lot of these feelings of dysphoria or feelings of uncomfortability was because I just don't really identify as a guy.
In the documentary Do I Sound Gay?, David Thorpe tries to find out what exactly it is that makes certain voices sound gay. He has recurring meetings with the speech-language pathologist and dives deep into the controversial subject of gay voices, why they develop, what they represent, and why some gay men are insecure about them.
Okay, let me rephrase the question.
Do I sound gay?
Do you guys think I sound gay?
Yes.
Yes.
I do, but I don't think it sounds as bad as you think it sounds.
The documentary points out that there isn't really a universal gay voice, but there are much more interesting areas of vocal development that are cultural and related to one's upbringing.
People think my straight friend Chris sounds gay.
A red cabbage and 2 strawberries.
I probably modeled my speech after the women I was close to growing up. Chris probably did the same thing. My gay friend Matt grew up close to his 4 jock brothers. He's the straightest sounding guy I know.
I pretty much was formed like every one of my other brothers.
The moral of the story is self-acceptance. After plenty of discussions about what it means to have a gay voice, he just stops doing the vocal exercises he was trying and accepts that he sounds the way he sounds. The movie explores that, unlike sexuality, we do have some interesting theories about how certain voices develop. But at the end of the day, there's no inherently gay voice, and you should just live and let live. And that's kind of how I view my pre-transition voice. I associate it with gay bears because those are the people who influenced me. But it's not like the voice itself is inherently indicative of that. And though in culture vocal gender presentation is often subverted for comic relief, I was starting to understand that it was all relative.
I don't know. I mean, aren't you gay?
What? I don't believe this! Where do these people get this idea?
There are many songs on 69 Love Songs that play with gender, like Papa Was a Rodeo, where the narrator sings to someone named Mike, who's revealed at the end to be portrayed by Shirley Sims.
I like your twisted point of view, Mike, when I think of what you said to me. Papa was a rodeo, Mama was a rock and roll band.
Stephen Merritt's intention while writing this song was that Shirley's character is a woman named Mike, a reference to Nancy Sinatra's character in The Wild Angels. But within the album's laissez-faire approach to gender, listeners might hear it differently, like, until I read Stephen's take, I assumed Mike was a man. Band member and manager Claudia Gonson has described the process of deciding who sang what on the album as choose your own gender. And because of this, throughout 69 Love Songs, gender is something that's frequently referenced and also very fluid.
Some people have really expressed to me over the years that they like about 69 Love Songs is the gender bender angle, which in 1999 was a little new, of having a girl named Mike, or it could be a man, that kind of feeling of just, it doesn't matter.
A reporter recently told me that they thought of it as the queerest record ever made.
Did they say why? Was it that gender bending element? Other pieces?
Yeah.
It's all over the record, this feeling of who's talking doesn't have to be, and even on stage sometimes we switch vocals and we have a female vocal playing what might have been a typical male role.
In a society that often makes a spectacle of deviations from gender norms for comedic or dramatic purposes, hearing an album so casually subvert gender roles in an earnest way had an impact on me, and got me thinking about why we even gender voices in the first place. But this was also when I was realizing that there was something deeply wrong, and that I felt like my experience of gender, and subsequently my life, was reading off of someone else's script. I often see trans women describe mistaking their desire to be a woman for being attracted to them. I don't think I ever experienced that exactly, but I do think I had a similar dynamic with masculine gay men. I modeled myself after the men I dated because I mistook my attraction to them for a desire to be like them. And since the bears I dated often liked other masculine men, being a mirror felt very intuitive, especially when my body went in that direction on its own. Knowing now that I'm a trans woman, it makes total sense in retrospect why one of the ways I tried to cope with my discomfort about masculinity was to give into it even more, since I did desire it, just in other people. But that dissonance made the process of being trans feel so different than being gay. Not that coming to terms with being gay was easier, it was just different. Realizing I was a gay man was about accepting a visceral physical attraction to men I was in denial about. But one of the main reasons why it took me so long to realize I'm actually a straight woman is because the confusing part for me was never who I was looking at, but where I was standing, which made it feel uniquely abstract and existential. And even when I tried to adjust that position by being non-binary, it still didn't feel quite right. Recently, I revisited John Grant's music video for Disappointing, and while watching, I genuinely had the thought, wow, what's it like to be a gay man? And it sounds ridiculous, but at the same time, it took that moment for me to realize that despite once trying to be one, I never really knew. And I was reminded of how lonely I was at the beginning of my transition. If I wasn't a gay man, if I was never going to be a bear, if I wasn't non-binary either, who was I? And how could I even know if I was a woman? I honestly had no idea. But I did know one thing. I wanted to do something about my voice.
So usually when I've spoken with people about my voice throughout my transition, it becomes quickly clear to me that the level of scrutiny under which I place myself feels very irrational to many people. And I usually justify it by saying like, oh, well, I just need to pass because it ensures my safety. And that's definitely true in a way, because it is very important for trans femme people, if they want to minimize discrimination and harassment, to pass or just like be assumed to be a woman by society and fit within that sort of gender binary. And truthfully, your voice is something that can have a huge influence on passing, because I don't know, from my personal experience, I know that even if I feel uncomfortable about like aspects of my physical body or whatever, if my voice is fine, then more times than not, I'll be gendered correctly. And that is generally how I've found my way through passing in society. But I also know that this answer of like, oh, I'm doing this because I need to pass, isn't as convincing to me as I think it is to other people. Because I also think that there's an aspect of this voice experience and changing my voice and figuring out just how to scrutinize myself in such acutely intimate ways. I think there is some sort of deep-rooted discomfort with being trans. Because for me, like, I am fully comfortable online existing as like a trans woman, and I'm very open, and I am very vocal about trans experience on the internet. But in person, what I prefer is when people don't know that I'm trans, when I go to the supermarket and nobody wonders or nobody asks me or nobody harasses me. And so I've been living this sort of like weird life where like, on the one hand, I'm very open, but on the other hand, my main experience of being trans is embracing when people don't even know that I am. And if that is what is like euphoric to me about aspects of trans experience, what does that say about my relationship with being trans? Like, do I really take pride in being trans? I think it's probably influenced just by the fact that I grew up during a time where trans identity is so important. I know many trans friends who are usually older, but not always, whose experience of being trans is much different than mine. They view being trans as like not necessarily who they are, but just like something they went through. But I do think it's interesting when comparing it with like someone like me who is very open about my identity and embraces it online. But I can also empathize with these friends in person, because I navigate the world nowadays as someone that people often assume is just cis. And I enjoy that. And I think that causes me to really like interrogate myself and be like, why do you enjoy that? What is wrong with being trans? And when I think about it, obviously there's nothing wrong with being trans, but then why do I feel uncomfortable when people know that I'm trans? Because there is the aspect of safety, but there is also something in me that prefers that people don't know I know. And I think it's easy to hide behind, oh, I'm just doing it because of society and transphobia, without really interrogating, where does my insecurity come from and why do I feel that way? But what is a trans voice? The simple answer is that a trans voice is just a voice from a trans person. But I also wouldn't be making this video if that was all there was to it. For transmasc and non-binary people taking testosterone, vocal changes are inevitable, but taking estrogen doesn't affect the voice. So for trans femmes and non-binary people taking that, changing one's voice becomes another option on the list of things you can do in a transition, but that's obviously not necessary. And the reality is, there is a huge variety of trans voices. But society often holds us to other standards. Trans femmes are often stereotyped as having deep, intimidating voices, and trans mascs are often assumed to have effeminate ones. A 2010 study found that transmasc voices were perceived similarly to gay voices, which is to mean that many transmasc people were assumed to be gay regardless of if they actually were. Trans people also hold ourselves to other standards. One of the reasons why I think it's so hard to talk about trans voices is because a decent amount of online discussion about that subject can be very toxic. From people projecting their insecurities onto others, to some taking pride in never having to do voice training, while simultaneously saying that others have tranny voices. And even if there isn't vitriol behind it, there is still an interest in grouping trans voices together in a way that I don't quite understand. Similar to gay voices, there appear to be influences and trends that might occur among trans people, but are not inherent to being trans. But while what a stereotypically gay voice sounds like can be relatively uniform both inside and outside of the queer community, a stereotypically trans femme voice seems to change based on context. Within mainstream transphobia, it can mean a deep voice or a Minnie Mouse type falsetto, but among trans people, it can mean something else entirely. And when I get comments saying I sound like ContraPoints, which, by the way, I take as a compliment, I wonder if it's because people just don't know that many trans women, or if it's because trans femme voices do cluster together in a predictable pattern. And that creates a weird insecurity that I didn't expect to have. I can be fully passing with my voice in everyday life and be assumed by many to be cis, but also among other trans people, I can have a recognizably stereotypical trans voice. And that contradiction seems to run rampant in online spaces in a harmful way. I've seen so many people whose voices would completely pass offline, but who still struggle with immense insecurity because of stereotypes that aren't really known outside of the trans community or among various transphobes who know too much about us. For trans femmes, passing offline usually involves speaking in a way that can't be perceived as masculine, but online, there's the added layer of speaking in a way that can't be perceived as trans feminine. And just like many aspects of transition, this hyper-scrutiny can become ultimately not about trans people, but gender presentation in general. I think it can be funny to look at the transvestigators who are convinced that cis celebrities are trans, but after spending time in trans voice spaces, I've found myself casually clocking the voices of cis women in my head, completely missing the point that voice training is supposed to be a tool to help trans and non-binary expression, not become another rigid system of gendered behavior to enforce on others. When people know you're trans, they will scrutinize your behavior more closely than they do cis people, so some feel the need to present a specific idea of gender to mitigate any possibility of transphobia. And for people who were entrenched in masculinity like I was, breaking from that can also mean running as far away from it as possible. But when this approach is codified with voice training techniques, it can mislead people to think that it is the same thing as passing, which isn't true. And even though there are voice resources and teachers who emphasize the liberatory aspect of voice training being a toolbox you can use as opposed to a requirement you have to fulfill, sometimes when I see people speak about voice, it seems like they're confusing specific types of subjective gender presentation with an objective view of masculinity or femininity. Passing is filled with contradictions. On one hand, it's a complex combination of various traits that come together to signal gender to others. But on the other hand, it can also seem simple, and to paraphrase Julia Serrano, it's often instantaneous. And though many assume this quick judgment is based on some inherent truth, it's actually an active projection of one's view of gender. And when I feel insecure about having a stereotypical trans voice to trans people while also passing among cis people, I wonder what the point of passing even is. Safety is important, and believe me, I'm familiar with awful transphobic harassment. But for me personally, I think relying on that as the sole explanation for my obsession with voice isn't really telling the whole story when I seem to have discomfort with being trans. And that's where passing splits. Do I want to be seen as a woman, or do I want to be seen as a cis woman? I do know some trans women who genuinely wish they were born cis, but I'm grateful for the journey I've been on, because it's made me who I am, and being gay was how I met my husband. But some days, I still feel insecure. But I honestly think that a trans voice is just the voice of a trans person. Learning about other trans people was one of the ways I slowly started to realize that I too could transition. And after I came out, I started diving deeper into the lives of people I once felt drawn to, but didn't allow myself to fully empathize with. One of those people was Candy Darling, a trans actress who lived in New York City in the 60s and early 70s, who's most known for her work with Andy Warhol and his social and artistic circles of the time. I first heard of Candy in high school through the Velvet Underground song Candy Says, which was also my first time hearing someone describe gender dysphoria. Since then, I had an interest in her. Her perseverance was inspiring to me. She suffered abuse growing up, but was able to overcome her upbringing and carve out a space for herself in a society that rejected trans people. And taking control of her gender meant turning it into art. Candy looked and sounded like the movie stars she grew up idolizing.
Some boys, well, when they take a girl in their arms to dance,
Some boys, when they take you in their arms to dance,
they make her feel sort of uncomfortable.
She feels sort of uncomfortable.
But with you,
I had the feeling you knew exactly what you were doing. And I could follow.
And I could follow you every step of the way.
Every step of the way.
After I started transitioning, I learned more about her and felt so moved to see someone else who took control of her own life while I was still learning to take control of mine.
I mean, I've already made myself happy. I mean, because I am in films. Well, there's nothing quite like it.
And after about 10 months of trial and error to find a new singing voice, one morning I woke up with Candy Says stuck in my head and recorded myself singing it. And that was the first time I truly heard my voice. Candy says, I've come to hate my body and all that it requires in this world. By this point, I had also obsessively watched basically every Candy Darling clip I could find online, and one in particular always struck me.
Ramona, I hear the mission bells above. Ramona, they're ringing out our song of love. I press you, caress you, and bless the day you taught me to care.
Hearing that clip had such an impact on me. Even though her diary entries showed that she struggled with self-doubt, you wouldn't know that by looking at her. She wasn't known as a singer, but she sang anyway. And though she wasn't raised to be a woman, she knew who she really was. And if she could sing like that, maybe I could as well. The mission bells above. Ramona, they're ringing out our song of love. I press you, caress you, and bless the day you taught me to care. To always remember the rambling rose you wear in your hair. Ramona, when day is done, you'll hear my call. Ramona, we'll meet beside the waterfall. I dread the dawn when I awake to find you gone. Ramona, I need you, my own. I honestly thought that there was like a point to self-hatred, or at least like, I don't know, for me, the main thing about being trans has been wanting to change, like wanting to transition. That's not what trans and non-binary experience is like for everyone, but for me, the impetus of realizing that I was trans and coming out was realizing just how dissatisfied I was with my body, my voice, my position in life, various things, gender, basically. And whether or not you call that like gender dysphoria or self-hatred, it laid the groundwork for my transition. And at the beginning, I thought that I could just listen to that. And I don't know, I thought it could guide me. Like if I'm really dissatisfied with certain things, I can just give in to that, and then that will push me in a direction to happiness. But I quickly became overwhelmed. It was like I thought I was renovating a house, but then I pulled up a floorboard and found out that there was a roach infestation. After not having really acknowledged gender dysphoria for 27 years, all of a sudden I couldn't unsee it. The hair on my body used to be a shield, but now it felt like an invasive species that wouldn't go away. And my voice used to be the only way I could escape my body. While singing, I would close my eyes and be taken somewhere else and could honestly just relax. But after coming out, singing became hell, and my voice became an anchor that was weighing me down. So I fell into it all. Voice training wasn't fun, it was agonizing, and I almost completely dropped out of my life. I stopped seeing my friends regularly and only really went outside when I had work. My days were spent talking to a mirror, following online tutorials, and obsessing over how voices work. So I've been trying to train my voice for about 4 days now, and I kind of have this feeling that I'm not able to get as loud as I used to. I'm trying to figure out how, A, it sounds to other people, but also if there's anything else I can do or specific exercises that will help me with this. Basically, over the past few days, I've been able to raise my resonance a lot. And I think that helps me to do articulation that feels natural and also just sounds to me more feminine. But what I'm trying to do is avoid using this sort of squeaky upper range and more talking in a way that feels natural and that I would use in everyday scenarios without feeling like I'm straining my voice as much as I did before. I think I'm starting to finally have a more controlled voice and a more dominant voice. I think I've been focusing on keeping my larynx high like I did before, but also keeping it at a much lower vocal range that might not only be more similar to how I spoke when I was speaking in a more masculine voice, but also one that just feels more natural and doesn't feel like my voice is being strained as much as before. So a few days ago, I posted on here after about 4 days of voice training, and something that I was very self-conscious about when I posted that was my vocal range feeling too high. Like it just felt very forced to me, and as a result, it tired me out very easily. And so in the last few days, I've been trying to experiment with how I can lower my vocal range while still maintaining the sort of feminine qualities that I've been working on. And so here's what it sounds like a few days later. I'm curious as to if this sounds passing for other people, and if not, what can I do better? Hi Reddit, I just wanted to check in. I mean, I've been talking all day, so I think my voice is a bit worn down, but I've also just in general been feeling kind of stuck with it. I mean, I got misgendered today, and that kind of really just made me feel awful, and so I wanted to post here and ask, is my voice passing? I really don't think I can even tell anymore. And if it isn't, what can I improve? How can I be better at it? Recording my voice for videos forced me to work on it and try to find some comfort in it, even if I felt insecure about it. And if you go back and watch the videos in the months after I came out in 2022, you'll hear the progression of how I spoke. So let's talk about mermaids and why I'm a woman now. Before I begin, let me just clarify a few things. I made a mistake in my last video. I had an idea for a video and I was like, oh, I should talk about this because I have a lot of thoughts about it. This video is brought to you by my Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much for keeping the channel going. I don't know, it's been a weird time here recently. I live in Germany, but my husband, who also works on the channel, he lives in the US still. I came out to her an hour later and started slowly coming out to my close friends while keeping it a secret for most people. Hi y'all, I'm currently on vacation right now. I'm currently visiting the United States. Finding a new voice for me was usually about alternating between 3 things: studying, trying, and settling. I studied the voices of other women, both cis and trans. I played interviews and videos all the time and used a frequency tracker to monitor the melody of each voice. And when I heard a phrase that stuck out, I'd repeat it and see if I could mimic the frequencies. Listening to interviews between a man and a woman were the most helpful for this, as that allowed me to see a visualization of the differences between both voices in real time. I also just tried many different things, doing impressions, making different sounds with my voice, following online tutorials, and other exercises to see what my voice was capable of. Trying to do an impression of someone else's voice and then noticing how it feels in my mouth and in my throat helped me start to develop a sense for how to control the voice. I had been a singer before transition, but never formally studied singing, so using my voice was mostly unconscious. I didn't really think about it. But doing this was the process of waking up my voice. And as I learned how to speak again, I also worked on singing, which was basically taking the principles I learned about talking in a feminine way and translating them to another context. But since I had never really thought about how to sing before, it became a different type of abstract process. I constantly worried that it felt like trying on costumes that ultimately weren't really me. But in retrospect, I see now that trying new things is actually about finding a way to break out of the costume I had been trapped in up until that point. Up where they walk, up where they run, up where they stay all day in the sun. Who's afraid bad wolf, the big bad wolf, the big bad wolf. I would go most anywhere to feel like I belong. Let me call you sweetheart. I'm in love with you. Let me hear you whisper that you love me too. To the place I know where I cannot go, where I long to be. Uptown you cater to a million jerks. Uptown your messengers and mailroom clerks. But ultimately, whatever my new voice was going to be wasn't going to be something that strained me, but felt comfortable. And so while I was doing these things, I started to pay attention to where my voice rested on its own, where it was right when I woke up, when I got tired, etc. And through that, I started to settle into a new voice. I wanted to avoid damaging it through overuse, so if I felt myself getting tired or things hurting or getting worse, I stopped and tried to not use my voice at all until it felt better. It took about a year for me to start genuinely feeling comfortable with my voice, and to be honest, I still feel like I'm working on it in some ways. So I'm editing this video, and I just want to mention that, like, on the subject of this stuff taking a long time to be internalized or be consistent, I had to re-record earlier parts of this video just because I feel like I was speaking in a slightly higher register than I usually do. But for me, it was genuinely frustrating to listen to just because it's not how I usually speak. And I think I have this insecurity of like having a different voice when I record voiceovers or videos and when I just speak casually. And I think that insecurity comes from like internalized transphobia in a way, because trans voices are often scrutinized for like being fake or put on or whatever. And for that reason, I think I monitor myself like really harshly to make sure everything sounds as natural as possible. I don't know, even before I transitioned, I had like a slightly different voice when I did voiceovers as opposed to when I spoke casually. And I, off the top of my head, can name some cis YouTubers who have slightly different voices like in vlogs as opposed to when they're doing videos. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is just that acoustics are different when you're recording with a microphone as opposed to speaking in a room or a different, larger space. The microphone just like picks up more nuances and you kind of adjust the way you perform for that situation. I know for me, I definitely speak differently when a microphone is up close to my face as opposed to when I am speaking to a larger room of people. And the second reason I think this happens is just because voices vary. Like, not every voice is always consistent in the same exact range, in the same exact resonance, as I say in voice training, which is just like the room you create with your mouth and just like the shape of your mouth and just like all that stuff that controls how your voice resonates, essentially. And I don't know, I think looking for like a super consistent thing can be useful for like understanding how that works, but ultimately the human voice varies and it varies based on context. I don't know, I'm very tired right now because I barely got any sleep last night and I think my voice is like slightly tired for that reason, but that's not because I'm trans. Like, that's not due to me being trans. And so the scrutiny that I place on myself is probably because of internalized transphobia. And y'all just don't really see this battle that goes on when I make videos because I carefully curate how I present my voice to you. So I just wanted to mention that because I think it's an important look behind the curtain when talking about voice training and just being a person on the internet presenting my voice to people. While I was struggling with my voice, my husband John was trying to get me to enjoy the process, to love myself at all stages instead of holding my self-confidence hostage until I was done. But I didn't listen. I only saw friends every few months and allowed myself to suffer. And when I tried to go outside, the physical and verbal harassment pushed me right back in. And this brought out what I sort of thought was a contradictory aspect of transition. I had to dislike my voice or body or whatever enough to want to change it, but also love it enough to not allow any dysphoria to consume me. And I was struggling with all of this while spreading a very queer positive message through my YouTube videos, which added a whole other layer of insecurity. Who was I to share trans pride when I couldn't even take my own advice? I wish I listened to John, because I think he was right. My voice started to pass after a few months, but it took far longer to actually convince myself that I was passing. You would think that if people heard your voice a certain way, you'd be able to hear it that way yourself, but it was much more complicated for me, and truthfully, on bad days, I still struggle with that insecurity. And it's those moments where I realize that I'm still recovering from allowing myself to embrace self-hatred so much. At the beginning of my transition, I thought if I let it guide me, if I embraced suffering, I would eventually emerge as an improved version of myself. And there are things I've done that have objectively alleviated my discomfort, like bottom surgery and hormones. But with my voice, it never became something else. There was never a transformative moment where my suffering made sense. And noticing myself struggle with voice in a way that seems to have little to do with passing has made me realize the long-term effects of that. I thought self-hatred could provide a foundation on top of which I built parts of my trans experience, but I now see that it was just digging me into a deeper and deeper hole. And that's usually what society expects of us. Trans people are often expected to hate ourselves, and honestly, I'm confused at how I came out during a time where there are so many diverse trans perspectives out there, and yet I allowed myself to be so harsh on myself, to not have any grace or empathy while I was going through such a difficult but beautiful transformative experience. Because 2 years later, I feel different, but in many ways I also feel the same, and that's a sign to me that there must be a better way. Thinking that trans experience is a dichotomy of switching between self-love and self-hate wasn't productive or helpful for me. And now I think that for me, truly appreciating what it means to be trans is more about understanding every aspect as part of the experience, instead of siphoning off some things as deviations from it. Because when I think about why I'm ultimately grateful to be trans, despite how much I've struggled with it, it's because of that. It's because being trans is about much more than I want to think it is. Also ich wollte einen Teil von dieses Video auf Deutsch aufnehmen, weil ich in Berlin wohne. Und wenn ich meine Transition erstmal begonnen habe, weil ich hatte auch nachgedacht, ich muss auch eine neue Stimme auf Deutsch finden oder lernen oder aufbauen. Deutsch und Englisch sind offensichtlich verschiedene Sprachen, aber ich habe auch Deutsch in der Vergangenheit von vielen älteren schwule Männer gelernt und weshalb habe ich Deutsch ein bisschen anders gesprochen, als wenn ich Englisch gesprochen habe. Also zum Beispiel...
When I spoke English, I kind of spoke it like this, like in this range around there. Aber wenn ich Deutsch gesprochen habe, es war ein bisschen tiefer und mehr in der Hals.
Also es war anders. Und ich wüsste auch, dass wenn ich eine neue Stimme auf Deutsch haben wollte, ich müsste auch die ganze Sprache neu lernen oder irgendetwas. Aber zum Glück in Deutschland sind die Kosten für Logopädie oder irgendetwas von der Krankenkasse übernommen. Und zum Glück habe ich auch jemanden in Berlin gefunden, die sehr transfreundlich war. Ich habe auch online gelesen, dass andere Personen haben Probleme mit Voice Training oder was zu machen, weil viele der Online-Ressourcen sind hauptsächlich auf Englisch. Und ja, das kann schwierig sein. Ich habe leider keine Lösung dafür, wollte aber das bemerken, da ich glaube, es wirklich sein kann, wenn jemand was lernen kann, die auf seine oder ihre Muttersprache ist. Es hat mehr Zeit gedauert für mich, auf Deutsch weiblich auszudrücken. Ehrlich gesagt, es gab ein paar Monate inzwischen, wenn ich gepasst oder was auf Englisch und dann, wenn ich das auf Deutsch gemacht habe. Vielleicht 5 Monate oder irgendetwas. Deutsch zu sprechen und die Prosodie oder Melodie von der Stimme zu erreichen, war schwieriger zu verstehen als Englisch. Und eine weitere interessante Sache, die mir meine Logopädin sagte, ist, dass Frauen in Deutschland und insbesondere Berlinerinnen manchmal tiefere Melodien in ihrer Stimme haben als andere.
Do you have any plans to go back to films?
Well, I've been making films off and on. Whenever there's a good story, I make a film.
Rat, drehen beruhigt dich überhaupt nicht. Aber du hast recht, wir dürfen die zwei auf jeden Fall in der Wohnung treffen.
Also wenn wir über Geschlecht oder Gender mit Stimmen denken, ist es auch wichtig zu wissen, dass wo eine Stimme liegt oder welche Stimmlage jemand benutzt, das kann auch kulturelles sein. Es muss nicht immer weibliche oder männliche bedeuten. Ja, es gibt viele andere Bedeutungen dafür auch. Wir müssen das auch erkennen, dass Geschlecht und Stimmen, das ist nicht in jedem Ort des Welts die gleiche. In 1962, Christine Jorgensen's nightclub act was featured in the Filipino movie We Who Are Sexy. Jorgensen had already made a splash as the first trans woman to be a celebrity in US American culture almost a decade prior, and her appearance in the movie was part of her attempt to expand her reach and become an international superstar. In his paper on Jorgensen's appearance in the movie, Emmanuel David looks at how Christine's voice had been perceived by others up until this point. When Jorgensen arrived in New York in February 1953, reporters sought to not only catch a glimpse of her, but to also record her speaking. One article, published with the headline "Christine Flies In," has soprano look, but not the voice, described Jorgensen as having a mannish voice, while another journalist reporting on her U.S. arrival characterized her as having a feminine alto voice.
I don't have any plans at the moment, and I thank you all for coming, but I think it's too much.
As a pivotal sonic event in transgender history, Jorgensen's transatlantic return made a trans voice audible for a broad public that, reporters seem to have thought, was eager to hear how gender transformation sounds. Jorgensen's voice continued to resound in the decade that followed, reverberating across space and time, eventually crossing the Pacific to places like the Philippines. In the movie, Jorgensen did a set that showed off her nightclub routine of the time, which included Great American Songbook choices, a Marlene Dietrich impression, and a rendition of the Filipino love song, Dahil Sa'yo.
Dahil sa'yo, nais kong mabuhay. Nais kong mabuhay. Dahil sa'yo. Dahil sa'yo, hanggang mamatay. Hanggang mamatay.
According to David, Jorgensen's performance symbolizes a turning point in the film, which centers around feminine boys and their queerness as represented by a Filipino concept of gender variance. But the performance serves as the beginning of the protagonist's transformation into masculine heterosexual men. And specifically Jorgensen's version of Dahil Sa'yo, where she doesn't know the lyrics, positions her as a specifically US American trans woman, painting her type of transness as a foreign phenomenon, which leads to the protagonists later being enlisted in the army and becoming more masculine, even if by the end it's not certain that they stay that way, hinting at local gender variance as well. David's analysis of Jorgensen's expression of womanhood and references to Susan Stryker's work on the same topic reminds me of how Jorgensen's specific type of transness was also linked with ideals of conservative, heterosexual US American whiteness beyond the movie, from the way she dressed, her public appearances, and how she spoke.
Is this a legal operation in the United States yet?
Oh, certainly. You know, they're doing it at Johns Hopkins now in Baltimore.
Heavens to Betsy.
Yes.
In her autobiography, she wrote about meeting gay men while in the army, but thinking that she couldn't be like them, specifically citing her religious beliefs. I've seen transphobes take this quote out of context to imply that she was a raging homophobe who maintained those beliefs throughout her life as justification for her transition, but the full sentence shows otherwise.
How do you feel about the problem of homosexuality?
Well, I don't personally believe that homosexuality is a problem to society in any way or form.
But even then, this quote does show where she was coming from and how her transness was contextualized within heteronormative society. Many people were transphobic to her, but those who accepted her often did so by contextualizing her experience within what they already knew. And with regards to her appearance in We Who Are Sexy, Jorgensen represented a type of transness that was not universal. Although Christine Jorgensen is featured in only one extended scene of We Who Are Sexy, the spectacle of her transsexuality, spotlit and center stage, creates a penumbra within the film where conflicting modes of sex, gender, and sexuality come into engagement with one another across the post-colonial divide. On the one hand, Jorgensen embodies the white, fashionably self-fashioning, glamorous ethos associated with the post-World War II US material culture that the film figures as ultimately desirable. And on the other hand, she represents a prospect that must be foreclosed. Despite her interest in catering to the Filipino market, Jorgensen was not successful. Her appearance in the film was ultimately a novelty, and in later cuts and screenings, not only was her name no longer featured, but in some versions her appearance was cut entirely. But this intersection of transness with US American whiteness was not unique to Christine Jorgensen. As I mentioned earlier, Candy Darling presented herself like the movie stars she idolized, and it's impossible to separate her expression, from her looks to her voice, from an aspiration to upper-class whiteness. While working on this video, I wanted to watch the full movie that the Ramona performance comes from, as despite that clip meaning a lot to me, I'd never watched the full context. And to my horror, I found out that earlier in the movie, Candy wears blackface to sing a version of St. Louis Blues. In a film structured around opera references, this appears to be referencing Othello, a work long associated with blackface, but the participation in a racist tradition highlighted Candy's role as a specifically white trans woman who wasn't generally interested in politics. She wanted to fit in with heteronormative society, and with that context, her diary entry about wanting to have a husband and kids in a suburban home shows a representation of the particular type of womanhood she aspired to. Even though Candy and Christine faced discrimination and hostility for being trans, the way their transness was perceived when compared to the experiences of trans women of color of the time shows how what it meant to be a quote-unquote respectable trans person was linked with race.
I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment. for gay liberation, and you all treat me this way?
In C. Riley Snorton's book, Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, he explores the cultural reception to Carla Brown and Ava Betty Brown, two trans women who were often interpreted in relation to Jurgensen's celebrity. Both Browns were cast in a diminutive relation to Jurgensen, largely described as latecomers to a conversation already established. Their characterization as mimetic figures finds some explanation in Homi Bhabha's work on colonial mimicry and the desire for a reformed recognizable other, as a subject of difference that is almost the same, but not quite. As mimicry pertains to the stories of Carla Brown and Ava Betty Brown, their media construction as Jurgensen's imitators illustrated, within a teleology of medicalized transsexuality, the impossibility of a Black Jurgensen, as they simultaneously exposed how anti-Blackness has been a critical paradigm for making sense of Jurgensen's figuration. And transphobic racism continues to have an impact both in and out of the community, affecting perceptions of masculinity and femininity, and exacerbating social, political, and medical discrimination.
When folks are Black and Latina mostly and are getting HIV at disproportionate rates, or being murdered at disproportionate rates, or trafficked into sex work at disproportionate rates, there's something about being Black and Latina in our white supremacist culture. We have to be fighting racism and classism and patriarchy along with transphobia.
After she came out, Abigail Thorne was pretty open about the type of womanhood she portrayed in her coming out video and how it would be perceived by the public, including how she spoke.
And I also knew, maybe this is an England thing, and it's unfortunate that this is the case, but I also knew that there is a particular understanding and aesthetic of what being a public figure in England is, which is this kind of ladylike, ladiness. There's a kind of delicate, white, posh femininity, as people are saying in the chat, that I thought, okay, it's gonna help people understand. This is what I mean. If I look and sound like the kind of woman public intellectual that they already know, it's gonna help. It sucks. I'm not sure I'm explaining it very well, and it sucks that I have to do that, or that I feel I have to do that, at least to start out by doing that. I think that people could very, very justly criticize me for choosing to do that. It's a fair criticism. Basically, I know what my casting is. I knew that if I played to my casting, it would help.
And as I've settled into my new voice and womanhood, I've been acutely aware of how specific my experience is. I can see and hear how other women have influenced me, but ultimately the process of settling into myself was about doing what feels comfortable. And it was only after I got further along in that process that I realized my feminine expression can be read as antiquated, binary, and conservative to others. And I think when navigating various systems that expect or even require a traditional binary version of a trans woman, my whiteness has an impact on that as well. Acknowledging that intersectionality is essential for advocating for gender liberation for everyone, as the trans and non-binary communities are not immune from the general cultural phenomenon of certain queer people getting their acceptance and then seemingly using that as a way to shut others out and confine our experiences to a predictable outcome, often for political, social, or financial gain. And as I've struggled with self-hatred in private while being open and accepting in public, I've been reminded of how internalized transphobia can be just as harmful inward as it is outward. And when I think about which type of womanhood I present to the world, and specifically how that sounds, I wonder if I might be part of the problem. So what I should probably mention at this point in the video is that I have a TikTok. And on TikTok, I don't do what I do here. I don't make video essays. Instead, I make videos about trans voices, and not necessarily like how to change your voice, but more just like I sing duets. Have a holly jolly Christmas. It's the best time of the year.
I don't know if there'll be snow, but have a cup of cheer.
I get like tens of millions of views doing this. I started doing this because in June, I posted a video of me singing a song from Beauty and the Beast, and they went viral overnight, like millions and millions of views. There's something sweet and almost kind, but he was mean and he was coarse and unrefined, and now he's dear and so unsure. I wonder why I didn't see it there before.
She glanced this way, I thought I saw, and when we touched she didn't shudder at my paw.
And that was my first time like seeing that level of virality, and so I thought, I kept my old voice because I liked singing before transition. I had heard of trans artists who had kept their old voices and sort of trained both of them at the same time, and I thought that could be useful for the future. And so I uploaded a video of me showing what I had learned, and it went viral. And so I was like, oh, I can continue exploring that. For like the past almost a year or so, I've been making videos doing this, and I even like released an EP of Christmas songs in which I was duetting myself. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. Like, I've gotten a lot of trans people just being kind of very shocked that you can even do that with your voice. Like, you can do both, you don't lose one or the other. And I think that's very positive. Definitely, like, my very first experience, there were like two formative experiences of like gender fluid voices. One was the Tokyo Hotel song Monsoon, and then the other thing was Nick Batera on YouTube, because when I was in middle school, he had a famous cover of A Whole New World from Aladdin in which he sang both parts.
And no one to tell us nowhere to go, to say we're only dreaming.
And that was one of my earliest experiences of being like, oh, you can do both? Like, I had never experienced that before. So to be that for people in a similar way is like, oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I don't mind doing that, because honestly, as I've shown in this video, I've struggled a lot with self-hatred. And so by making these TikToks and kind of embracing my older voice and not really viewing it as like an anchor that's holding me down, but instead something that like is just drag, essentially, I think that I found a new type of acceptance for my voice in its entirety. However, last November or so, I started going viral on the wrong side of TikTok. And I've gotten like a lot of transphobia before on the internet, but nothing like this. I couldn't handle just the constant influx of hate comments. When this first started and it was really ramping up, I had my first show in like since transition in Brooklyn, and I was spending all my time at home just like reading through my phone, trying to keep up with everything. Because in that position, you think like, oh, if people are saying, you kind of think, oh, I should keep up to date with this. I should have some idea of what people are saying about me. So I was trying to do that, but you can't mentally expect someone to do that. So I ended up just ignoring my notifications, and I did the show anyway, and everything was fine. And since then, I have had like a recurring audience of transphobes that look at my content, but it woke me up to a side of the internet that I was vaguely familiar with but had never experienced personally, and it got me to severely like rethink what it was that I was even doing, because I do these duets on TikTok, and on the one hand, I think that there is a wonderful diversity of trans voices that is honestly very untapped potential in mainstream culture. There's usually this sort of like stereotyping of trans women as having deep voices, but like you can also use our entire vocal range in a trans positive way. It doesn't have to be the punchline, or it doesn't have to represent violence towards trans people and stuff like that. So I find that very interesting, but also this whole situation just made me acutely aware of like what image I was putting out into the world, and if that image of a trans voice being high and low and juxtaposed was negative or having a negative effect. And so, I don't know, I started to post more infrequently. When I would do lives, I wouldn't want to do the duets. And that was kind of my way of seeing, just like, I understand it's like a one trick that I do, like a party trick essentially, using different voices that I'm trying to use earnestly, but I thought maybe I can tone it down and see what happens. And unfortunately though, what I found was that the sort of transphobic hate that I received, it did not stop when I stopped doing that. I have seen trans women stereotyped for having higher voices, for having lower voices, for having androgynous voices. There are so many kinds of stereotypes that result from transphobia. And I've seen trans people kind of try and fight these stereotypes by leaning in a completely other direction. And I think that's where you kind of get a lot of the sort of, honestly, transphobic trans people. These people who brag about how passable their voice is, but then severely judge the voices of other trans people. They try to paint this image of like, this is how you're supposed to be trans. This is what you need to do to be one of the respectable trans people in society. And of course, I'm talking about voice, but this principle, it exists in many different ways in the trans community. Defying stereotypes isn't bad, but defying stereotypes as if that's the only way out of transphobia is where that kind of just becomes very toxic. And so making this video has been kind of me like wanting to hold myself accountable and being like, okay, what have I been doing? And I wanted to kind of get to the root of like, why do I have this sort of obsession with voice in so many different ways? Also, as I've shown you, I'm very insecure about it still. And I think what I realized is that transphobic stereotypes are not solved by defying them. They are resolved by just completely ignoring them, completely establishing a different playing field. You can't refute things that are irrational. You can't refute these sorts of one-dimensional views of these people who live completely complex lives. I'm grateful that through transition, I've like tried a bunch of different things and I've found a way of expressing myself that feels so natural. It just feels so like me. It seems very abstract, and transition in many ways requires work, or at least it requires some concerted effort, but also it doesn't. A close friend of mine was doing voice training, and at one point she had a conversation with her vocal coach in which he said, you know, you kind of have to want to change your voice to have it change, and it doesn't seem like you really care that much. In a world in which trans people are so unfairly scrutinized, I think it's important to mention that my friend only let me include this story on the condition that I clarify that she did not think he was being an asshole, and ultimately she realized that he just pointed out her attitude towards voice training. Her mild vocal dysphoria was not a strong enough incentive to find and identify with a new voice, and she wasn't that interested anymore, so she just stopped going. And I think that's wonderful. I think to be able to know yourself is really a privilege that everyone should be able to have. And I think one of the beautiful things about transition is that you have the opportunity to build a relationship with yourself, to build a bridge to a place that you never knew you'd be. And so when I think about what a trans voice is, I don't really know. I don't think it presents in a particular way, but all I know is that I've found it. My husband John is joining me in Berlin this year, so while visiting the US a few weeks ago, I continued chipping away at the long process of boxing up the apartment and deciding what we'll sell, what we'll donate, and what we'll take with us. I can only imagine what it feels like to sort through 63 years of your life and decide what to take with you and what to leave behind. But I think transitioning has shown me something like that. I don't think it's a uniquely trans experience to reassess your life at some point and decide if you're really living the way that you want to. But I do think being trans thrust me into a particularly intimate, existential version of that. And so I cleaned house, sorted through my mind, my presentation, and figured out what to take with me. And though I thought I would be completely abandoning who I once was and how I once sounded, I'm learning that even though passing is something I've aimed for and struggled with throughout transition, I don't wish to be cis, and learning how to earnestly embrace the diversity of my trans voice has helped me in ways I don't even think I fully understand yet. While I was boxing up things, I noticed that I still have copies of my old albums. In particular, there were many CDs left of The Good We've Sown, an album I put out in 2017. And while I was able to put most of my CD collection in yard sale boxes, or just dispose of or recycle the others, it felt wasteful to just get rid of unopened copies of an album, even if they weren't going to be sold. But at the same time, the CDs had to go. Honestly, I feel like a completely different person than I was when I made that album, and even if one day people are interested in buying copies of my old music, that's not the case right now, and I only had so much time to clean up my things, so I decided to donate a chunk of them. When I toured through the US in college, one of my favorite things was going to various Goodwills or other thrift stores across the country and finding things I had never heard of. Growing up on the internet, there was always so much music at my fingertips, but in a way it also felt limited to what was online, so whenever I got to go to a random town and find an album from a local musician I didn't know, it was special. And for that reason, there are albums I listened to during this time that seem to have only been known by a small subset of people who have since moved on, and their cassettes or CDs ended up at the bottom of a donation pile. And there are a lot of albums like that, songs that once meant something to a friend group but never had a wider reach. Jake's music was like that. I played a lot of shows, shared special moments with others, and I've been told by friends and friends of friends that The Good We've Sown was a formative album for that time in our early 20s. But the music never made it in the way I aspired to, and Jake had to stop existing for me to become Marlena. So the songs just live on now through fond memories and 100 unopened CDs in a New York City apartment. But I didn't want that to be it, so I went to a Goodwill to donate some of the unopened copies. Don't worry, I didn't saddle a random store with 100 copies of an album nobody wants to buy, but I did give them a few. Who knows, maybe there will be someone like I once was who stumbles upon them, an album from a person they've never heard of. And they'll look it up and find out that it's still online under a different name, and they'll see that the person who once made that album still exists, just in a different way. Or not. I mean, maybe they'll just end up in a trash bin. But I find the possibility of what could be more fulfilling than the punctuation I used to always want to put at the end of every sentence. I really like that Christine Jurgensen quote I played at the beginning of this video because of how she embraces ambiguity.
We don't take into account this true scientific value that each person is actually both. Now, this sounds a little evasive, and I don't mean it to be, when in all actuality my only answer to that is that I am more of a woman than I am a man.
Anchoring it within some biological vocab was very of the time, but I like her insistence that these categories are relative, and so she is more of a woman than she is a man, not because she isn't a woman, but because gender is much more complicated than many want to admit. And when I looked at the bag full of the remaining CDs of my album from 7 years ago, I thought about all I've been through since then and remembered how glad I am to be more here than there. I couldn't see a thing. 6 hours in a blizzard. I then went and cried in Caroline's apartment. We brought some bagels, and under a scorching hot sun saw Sarah speaking down the barrel of a gun. I waited for your call, I knew it'd never come, but I'm not the only one. The train broke down. I pulled out my phone. The leash flew off the dog you thought you owned, and the wind swept through and made the kind of sound I can only hear when there's no one else around. I'm sure if you wanna come, it's not too late. Just take another and maybe we won't have to wait. I'll block out the sound coming from outside of your ex-boyfriend wanting to die. The other day, someone bombed our sandwich place. The other week, Jorge showed me memories in a park. You hugged a tree as the snowfall covered my face, and I found a new meaning of grace. The years went by. I put my foot down and felt a shock wave take me out. I saw you loudly snoring on the floor, and someone shut the door. I was surprised, but I guess that's what doors are for. Fear, but it was in a different place, and I'm sure you know the rest. So while you yell at me for show, I won't pretend that I even know who I was 10 years ago. I'm not going back, not gonna shave my hair, because I'm more here than I ever was there.